Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. Today, I am joined by our guest, Sean Cottrell. Listeners, Sean is CEO and co-founder of Law in Sport, the world's leading sports law website, knowledge hub, and global community of over 30,000 members. And today, we are going to talk more about some key issues in anti-doping, Sean's career, and some prominent cases in anti-doping. So, Sean, thank you so much for being here with us. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, we are excited to chat more about you and the work that you do, but perhaps you could start by first telling us a little bit more about Law in Sport and its mission.
Yes, so Law in Sport is a knowledge hub and global community of people that are really interested or want to know about or working the legal and law as it applies to the sports sector. So if you want to know about the latest legal issues and developments that are taking place in the sector, then typically people will go to Law in Sport to find out. That's what we do. And then we've got a lot of people that use us around the world. So we have about 400,000 people that use us around the world on an annual basis. We have institutional members who are about 100 or so professional services firms, many of them you'll know very well. And then lots of sports organisations such as FIFA, the Football Association, the EFL, the FIM, the FIA, World Rugby, City Football Group, Red Bull Group, and I can't name all of them. We'll be here all day. And then the other thing is any former current professional athlete, as long as they're not a qualified lawyer, because they can afford a membership, they can use Law in Sport for free, come to any of our events for free, come attend any of our courses for free. So we do a lot to help athletes in particular, whether it's on career transition, getting into law, or just pointing them in the right direction if they want to understand sports regulation or law in more detail.
Very cool. I think this is a phenomenal organization. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your story. So, Sean, where did your interest in sport and perhaps sport law in particular begin?
I guess like most people, I'm laughing because I guess like most people working in sport, it probably came from participating in sport in the first place. So loved basketball, played rugby, although turned away from that because it was too painful.
Fair.
And wet and cold, but a great sport that it is. But yeah, I love sport. As I think most people get in the sector would identify with this, sport was my identity. Yeah, apart from what I did as a living, I wasn't good enough, I don't think, or maybe I was good enough, but not disciplined enough necessarily to be a professional athlete. But I basically ended up leaving school at 16, playing sport a lot, but then worked as an office junior and then in various roles in accounts departments for international law firms such as DLA Piper, Simmons & Simmons, Cameron McKenna, and others. And the only thing I was still really interested in when I did that was sports. So I went to study sports science at the University of Essex. We had a really good sports science department, and we got to find out about the Balco scandal. This is a long time ago now. And in particular, I remember looking at issues around gene doping at the time, and I just thought that was absolutely fascinating. So I think my first sort of real intersection with sports law was then. And then years later, fast forward, I did a law conversion, they call it over here, amongst many other different things. And I just tried to basically, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a lawyer. I wasn't sure if I wanted to become a physiotherapist or something like that. I don't think I did, but wanted to do something of having significant impact on the world. And so I remember typing in Google sports science and law, and an association called the British Association for Sport and Law was established, and they held one of their first events, and I went to that. And that's when I met a guy called Alfonso Varela and ended up setting up Law in Sport with.
That's so cool. So can you tell us a little bit more about this serendipitous meeting with Alfonso and maybe how Law in Sport emerged from that meeting?
So, yeah, there was a few of us who were basically just chatting away. I had previously tried to build a website to help international students get visas to the UK where I was a student. I got interested in sort of open source technology and things like that. And that's some HTML, PHP and CSS. And we basically ended up chatting. He was running a website at the time doing news aggregation as part of the IU Sport, which I think is still going. And it was like this news aggregation Spanish website. And he was doing the UK version of that. And I started to help him do research on the latest developments. And then we ended up deciding that actually the best thing to do would be to set up a separate website that was going to be more focused on people publishing articles and analysis. And it basically just evolved from there.
Very cool. And you mentioned that this story perhaps took place some time ago. How has the organization grown and evolved over the years?
The legal sector has been, if you say, for example, in North America, there's people that were founders of the Sports Lawyers Association there when they recall stories, I think in the early 90s of having like 25 people in a room or so. And then obviously now at their conference has about 800 people. I think the last year I couldn't make it, sadly, this year, but about 800 people that turn up. So you can see that there's been an explosion in how the law and how lawyers influence the sports industry, typically as it's grown and matured as a recognised economic activity, right? And it's influenced both socially, financially, how that's influenced it globally from a law and sport perspective. It basically, one of the reasons we kind of set it up in the way that we did was the general view at the time, and was my experience, was that the only way you could get access to accurate legal information on sports law was to pay a lot of money to academic legal journals. Often, by the time the journals were published, lots of information was outdated. It was very long, wasn't easy to read. And so we tried to basically use the open source type principles basically to disseminate to the widest possible audience, but still maintain the sort of academic integrity with having an editorial board anonymously reviewing our content. And then critically, the other thing was, which can be a problem with some academic research in law anyway, at least over the years, I think it's better now than it ever has been, but previously certainly was the case that some of the research was funded and wasn't really disclosed it was funded, and therefore you weren't really sure, or the conflicts, weren't identified or clearly labelled. So you were reading a piece of research or critical analysis and you didn't really understand that that person actually represented one of the parties, or, it was just really hard to grasp. So we tried to bake that into our system, and we didn't allow people to pay to play, and we still don't. So you can't pay to write for us. You can't pay to speak for us. Any of our events or any of the articles that we publish are all done free of charge. We see that as giving us one, independence, but integrity in terms of how we treat everyone individually with respect and dignity throughout that process, but also in terms of obviously how we influence the market by staying objective and analysing facts, making sure the law is accurate that we're covering, or the regulations, and accessible. I like to think we've been a huge positive contributor in the world in terms of disseminating this information, which is, we kind of say now, to try to articulate it to people. If people try to go to external counsel, so let's go to a lawyer, so for those people who aren't familiar with the sort of legal terms, and try to get an opinion piece from them, like an advisory note, that would be the equivalent to one of the articles we publish. Often it will cost you in the region of about £10,000. So I'm not sure what that'll be in dollars, but a lot of money anyway, because all of our content is honestly peer reviewed. We have a lawyer now internally that reviews, one of two lawyers that review the content, that I review still every piece of content that we publish. So we take it very, very seriously, our sort of position in the market. And I think hopefully that's been useful for people over the years, that they can rely on our information and then go up and either do their research or take a different approach to how they're interpreting or engaging with regulation or governance in sport, or in this case, anti-doping.
Absolutely. And Sean, I really like these elements that you mentioned of transparency and rigor, and kind of having this process where things are sort of peer reviewed like it would be in academia.
Yeah, I think it's really important, because the one thing that came out early in the process was, if people knew, because it's a small sector, people often had biases because of their interaction, and particularly in litigation, and it's in anti-doping in particular. If you have an athlete lawyer who's a federation lawyer, for example, and they've only met during a hearing, they might have a particular view of that person. Both of them may have particular views of each other, and when they're in another setting and actually get to meet and discuss in an unrelated environment, they typically find that their views may change of that individual. And what we found, that was certainly people were dismissive at the early stages when they knew that someone had written an article from a certain firm, or they knew the individual, they had a bias either for or against that individual, whether it was consciously or subconsciously. And so we just felt that we had to anonymise it just to make sure we address that. And also, because that's a small sector, in order to get the world's leading experts to review the content, if we didn't take that approach, it's changed now, but at the time, I don't think some of those people may have been so willing to review the content, just because they felt like, whatever conflicts that may be there, they may be reluctant, or it may put them in an awkward position that they wouldn't want to be in. They kind of serve multiple purposes, really.
Absolutely. And you mentioned earlier that this industry has really matured and exploded, as you said, in the past decade or two. But I think that doesn't guarantee necessarily that your website or community, something that you are building in the industry, will grow, but it definitely did in your case. So, Sean, what do you see as maybe some of the key ingredients for the success of law and sport?
Well, I always say to people that we were popular before we were successful. One of the challenges, I think, of working in the sports sector generally, I'm very privileged to work in the sector. We're very privileged to work with the people that we work with to do what we do, right? We don't take that lightly. However, sometimes in sport, we can focus too much on the glamour of the sector, not the reality, because we love the sport, we love the spectacle, we love the competition. And I think from a law and sport perspective, we see ourselves as being world leaders in what we do, but it's a very small market. So that's one thing that's helped us. Secondly, is really caring about having an impact. You hear people talk all the time, and we know the risks that are involved in this from an anti-doping perspective, but just from a duty of care perspective on the athletes. But, high performance is always talked about in sport. And, for us, our high performance or our good performance is, number one, having impact. That's what we want to do. We want to have a positive impact and help people create a more sustainable sports industry. Overarching, that's why do we want to give people access to better legal information? Well, hopefully then the contracts are better, the regulations are better, it's a safer environment, it's more sustainable, it's more investable. So from that perspective, taking what was really expensive content and making it freely available or more freely available was going to be a recipe for success in itself. But I like to think our consistency over time, our integrity in terms of how we treat people individually, but also our desire to genuinely, we work with organisations, and if we get stuff wrong, we try not to, but we will correct it. We're not trying to take a particular position. And whilst I'm very opinionated privately, from a public perspective and from a law and sport perspective, we try to take our position as making sure that, if we have opposing views, that people have the opportunity to share those opposing views. Again, as long as they're legally accurate, factually accurate, and it meets our sort of review process, anyone in the world, whether you're a student or whether you're an athlete, can contribute to law and sport. So from a success perspective, we just took something that was very expensive and made it cheap to access. So I think that was helpful. And then the other part of the success was understanding that if it was true that as a principle of rule of law, everyone should understand the rules and regulations that govern their behaviour, that in a sports context, if people didn't understand, say, anti-doping regulations, if they didn't understand governance frameworks, if they didn't understand the contracts that they were signing, whether it was a commercial contract or a representation contract, it was going to cause problems. Right, for any organisation, right? So it had to be true from my experience anyway, and that's what the view we took. It had to be true that it'd be better for everyone rather than the small number of executives who understood this or like senior lawyers working in the space. It was going to be better for the whole industry if everyone had a better base level of understanding, right? Because then we can hopefully identify what problems there are and try to resolve them in the best way possible.
That makes sense. I think that is phenomenal. And it has grown considerably, as we mentioned, from, the two people that it started with to the bustling community that it is today. But you touched on this a little bit, but Sean, can you maybe give us some detail about the kinds of information and resources that Law and Sport provides, and maybe how it's filling a gap for people who are really interested in sports integrity and anti-doping and looking for this content?
So we do a lot of different things, but I sort of it's those three strands that people will maybe understand in a simple way. We produce our content. So we produce a lot of analysis. So like, say, for example, with the current issue with the 23 Chinese swimmers and the investigation that's going in China or WADA, for example, we just published a 3-part piece on that that's been, again, anonymously peer reviewed. We've gone through it at length to try to help people have a better understanding of the intricacies and complexities of what's going on, rather than just come out with a statement. Try to really get to the meat of it, like what the regulations say, how does an investigation work, that sort of stuff. So on the content side, we do that. So we'll either focus on particular cases, we'll focus on regulations, we'll focus on updates. So we do that from a written perspective, but we've also got our podcast, we've got our webinars that we run. Sometimes we do workshops. We also host private roundtable discussions. So we do that. And the other point we've got, let's say we focus on career development of athletes, particularly in anti-doping. A lot of athletes want to know about how the process works. They'll get better information. But on the career side, we run a global mentoring scheme. So we've mentored 250 people from 30 countries around the world. They've ended up in various roles in sports organisations, law firms and dispute resolution bodies. We run an international mood competition where anti-doping this year was one of the problems, and last year as well, where we did the finals at the Court of Arbitration for Sports. We had, I think, 70 teams last year, 50 teams this year from, 15, 20, I can't remember now exactly, countries around the world. And we ended up with 8 teams at the finals in Lausanne. And then we helped fund some of the students to get there, which would be pretty cool, something we do on that front. We also help people find lawyers. So we recruit lawyers for various sports organisations and law firms and others. And then on the third strand, on the community side, whilst that overlaps with the careers and with the content, obviously, because we're serving the community that way, we run lots of different events. So we do various conferences. We did an anti-doping conference. It was online, though, during COVID, but we will be doing another one at some point in the near future. Watch this space to find out more about that. So from that perspective, there's kind of the 3 strands that we really work in when we're looking at how we actually helping people. The next thing we do is then we try to, and I think in anti-doping at the moment, it's really challenging always, because you're dealing with a global system with vastly different bodies, with vastly different resources. And I kind of used to love what David Howman used to say, which was like, they're trying to deal with a global problem with a very limited budget, respective to what the problem is. So how do you deal with that? So from our side, when we look at these things and go, what's the noise to signal ratio? in anti-doping, obviously you can get a lot of people just go like, doping's bad. When they're looking at doping, they're looking at offences where you might be an administrative, like a whereabouts offence, right? There may be other issues that are at hand, which they just classify into doping. So really try to, for us to sort of take a step back and say, what can we do that's going to be impactful, that's going to help people have a better understanding of what's going on, given that they may not be, whilst a vast number of people every day, a lot of people aren't. They're normally dealing with it as and when there's a particular issue that flares up. So how do we best serve people in that regards? Or say, for example, where there's issues of contamination, meat contamination cases, right? What can we do? Just going to listen to the various actors in the space and try to give them a platform to express what they think the concerns are.
That makes sense. And I think one of the things that makes law that's specifically related to anti-doping particularly complex is that you have to have some ability to understand the science that's underneath it. So how do you incorporate some of these new scientific findings that are coming out into the content that you produce?
So one of the, I think the strengths of our model is knowing that we don't know that much. So, making sure that we don't assume that we've got a really good understanding. So particularly on issues of science, we will go to people that know and we'll reach out, and we've got no ego in that regards. So we'll just reach out to people, whether they're scientists, whether they're lawyers that can understand and interpret that, and ask them for their help and assistance with it. And I think, we're very privileged that people engage with us. I think partly because they understand what our sort of overall mission is and what our intentions are. So as always with that, you have to, it doesn't matter if it's an issue of law or science, you have to go to an expert. You just have to, in my opinion. I don't think you've got any other option. And then ideally, you go to multiple experts.
Absolutely. And we talked about some of the different kinds of content you produce, but what have been some of the perhaps most popular topics or articles that Sport and Law has covered that your community seems particularly interested in learning about?
Well, the current one was an investigation into the 23 Chinese swimmers, quite popular at this moment in time.
Right.
I think years ago, the one I enjoyed a lot, and more just because it was such a fascinating case, was the Liam Diak case, obviously with the Russian runners and the suppressing the biological passports. That, for me, was just absolutely fascinating to get to interview Sir Anthony Hooper, who did the investigation for Michael Beloff, KC, for the time, I think it was the IAAF, now obviously World Athletics. That was particularly popular, I think, at the time. And then we, as part of the anti-doping conference, we had a really good discussion with Jonathan Taylor, KC, Paul Green, and Jeff Nowitzki on the issues of what the right approach is around meat contamination in particular. So why are certain thresholds are set at weights, and was the approach? And what was great about that was before that session, it was kind of perceived that there may be really differing views. And actually, when we had the discussion, they were much closer actually in terms of where they believe things should be than we initially thought that would be the case when we first thought about putting that panel on.
I think that's wonderful. And I think it's always nice when everybody sort of agrees. It makes the discussion go a lot more smoothly. But I think these are definitely some hot topics. Are there gaps or areas that you feel like you maybe still have not yet addressed the needs for particular kinds of content?
Yeah, currently at the moment, I think some of the issues around the difference between the actual laws and regulations and guidelines and how they should be interpreted and applied and the consistency of that. And again, just generally, I think at this moment, over the recent case highlights, just the complexities of dealing with international law, dealing with different bodies. I think some analysis and then more deeper analysis of those type of, what practical challenges does it represent, I think will be very welcome from our side. Gene doping is always one of my favorite topics that I don't know enough about and I need to learn a lot more about. But I think that sort of advancement of technology and how it's being applied, both from a positive perspective, but also from a preventative and a doping perspective, is really useful. But also then looking ahead and what practices people may be using, I think that's fascinating. I think, I'm not sure if this is controversial in the space, because I think everyone knows, but conflicts of interest is always a hot topic in sport generally. As I said, it's a small world. Anti-doping is even smaller, the subset of that, with only a limited number of experts, and how we deal with that. I say we as if I've got some influence in it, but we're talking this all collective we, but I hope people understand what I mean by that. But I don't think there's people in there that want to be in positions where they've got conflicts of interest, or they're always the person that gets relied on as an expert witness, or there are only laboratory that's used, etc. I don't think there's that type of environment there. But I do think, again, as the sports industry has grown at rapid pace, if you look at the infrastructure around the anti-doping side of things, is it really fit for purpose to deal with that currently, to deal with that level of scale? I'm not sure is the answer. But I'd love any analysis on that and how we deal with it from a practical perspective will be welcomed. I know that WADA are obviously looking at things like that. I wasn't able to attend the last symposium, but I know from previous ones, that's something they're always sort of reflecting on, and I'm sure the NARDOs are as well. But I think that's a real challenge.
Absolutely. I think there are a lot of areas of sort of continued evolution within the anti-doping space, but you've had quite a few successes so far. So, Sean, do you have a favorite success story from your career or the work that you've done with law and sport that you'd like to share with all of us today?
I was thinking about this, and I was sort of motivated by impact and people more than anything else. So say, for example, in an average week on a personal level, I may deal with 30, 40 different people easily in the course of a week on a variety of different topics, whether it's on commercial IP, whether it's on anti-doping, whether it's on match fixing, whether it's on regulation, whether it's on dispute resolution. It doesn't matter what it is. We're kind of across a lot of different areas. So I was trying to reflect back and think, what are some big wins? And I guess one that I thought, it's a bit geeky, really.
Even better.
Marjolaine Verrett and David Cowan did a talk at King's College University in London, and they were looking at the international standards for laboratories. So they were doing a presentation, and I remember pulling up the regulations at the time and also the standards at the time and looking at issues around expert witnesses and what you're allowed or not allowed to do as a lab. And then later on, Natalie Sinclair Clark wrote an article basically saying, some of the issues that I was able to flag to her. She did this fantastic analysis of what issues that then present when you're trying to find expert witnesses. So for those who don't know, if you're a scientist working at a WADA accredited lab, you can't criticize the research and you certainly can't represent athletes. Right? And it makes sense from a practical perspective. It makes perfect sense, but also it does create a problem for athletes trying to find the right level of experts to represent them in very technical cases. So that, I think, was something that springs to mind. And then, there's a number of athletes that have helped out over the years, but just need to be signposted to find the right expert, particularly legal representatives. So just helping people, right? So to make sure that they can, particularly from the athlete's side, when they've got a very stressful situation, that they can be assured, and also from the governing body's perspective, also to be assured that they've got good lawyers as well, because that saves them time and money. Typically, they don't waste time on ridiculous arguments, but putting them in a position where in that stressful environment, they've got the right process to go through, particularly in the cases where, the athlete has made, no one's accusing them of being intentionally doping, but they're just in a situation, I don't know, whether or not they haven't paid attention to supplements or administrative error, as I alluded to earlier, that they can then get really good counsel. They know it's going to be dealt with properly and appropriately in a fair and just way. That's always deeply, deeply satisfying.
Certainly. I think being able to see the impact of your work firsthand can be really powerful and really motivating. And you've mentioned a few examples throughout our conversation of different ways that law and sport, and you specifically, engage with or interact with different partners who are in the general sport and specifically anti-doping space. But can you give us some more detail about some of these partnerships? I think they're absolutely critical for moving the field forward.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And if anything, this is one area that we could do a lot better job, I think. Because say, for example, in terms of your organisation, fantastic organisation, does run great events, but obviously the research it funds and everything else that it does is absolutely fantastic. And I think actually we could do a better job of being aware and signposting to organisations. I think that's when we do our best work at times. That's what we do, whether it's with the ASA Institute, with you guys, with other organisations, when we're saying that this is a really good resource. And I think at the moment, one of the challenges is, again, if you look at the space, there's so many, whether WADA are doing their own educational courses, USADA, UCAD, it doesn't matter who it is. There's all these different programs going along. I think from our side, I think understanding which ones are valuable at a particular moment in time and signposting the right audience to that, because we have got a big audience, and signposting people to that is something that we do, but I think we could do a lot better at it. And then the other thing I should have said, sorry, on the highlight, I was just thinking about it. The highlight is working with people like Howard Jacob, Paul Green, Jonathan Taylor, working with people in the space, getting to speak to Travis Tygart, Nicole Sapslead, all these people that are actually working in anti-doping at a coalface, and having Ross Wenzel at WADA. I'm just going to think of all the people, Michelle Verroken, from the name as many people as I can, Marjolaine Verrett, etc. But all these great minds and great people that have got so much experience and who have been willing to share their knowledge. I should have said that with helping the athletes get the right advice is probably the pinnacle of it. But I think from working with organisations, I think the key thing would be we love to work with organisations, particularly where they're not for profit. So when in an anti-doping space, people who are really just trying to focus on educating others and doing that, I think that's something that we've been trying to grapple with in terms of what is our strategic approach with doing that in a way, because we serve a lot of people. We're only a small team of 100 people on an editorial board, and we're very thankful for these people that give up their time for free, who are experts. we're only a small team, and so we've got limited time. So to try to make sure we're signposting people to the right areas is a challenge for us, but something we're always willing to do. So my call to action would be, look, hey, if you're doing really useful stuff that you think would be useful to other people in this space, to have them a better understanding or providing critical analysis, please let us know, because we'd love to share it, whether it's like, play the game or the work that you guys are doing. So that's how people can better engage with us. I guess from the other side, if people want to write articles, if they think like they've got something, as long as they want to go through the review process, which is normally quite quick, it takes a couple of weeks from start to finish. But if people want to write articles or they think that there's stuff that we should be covering that we're not, I'm aware that there's a lot probably we don't cover, please get in contact. We'd love to hear from you.
Wonderful. And I think something that you highlighted in your response just now is just the international reach and sort of scope of the people that you reach with your content. So can you comment on what it's like serving such a broad audience?
It's fun at times, challenging, I think, particularly in this day and age, because as I said, people are getting a lot of information thrown at them all the time. I think the nuances of the sports sector is most people are not as well resourced as we think they are. They're trying to cover a lot of different areas. It's a real challenge, both from a budgetary perspective, from a time perspective. And there's a lot of eyeballs looking at everything that you do, which means that the pressure is there. So as great as it is a privilege to be in there, there's a lot of pressure because you might make a mistake in another business, which is a minor mistake, or you make a decision, if not a mistake, and no one really cares. But if you do it in the sports sector,
people notice. Yeah.
People are looking at you. So from our side, I guess, luckily, we're not trying to be in the forefront of getting people's attention in that way, but really trying to work with the various, both individuals and organizations to understand the challenges that they face is something that, given the international diversity, the domestic diversity as well, the organizational diversity, it can be really challenging. Say, for example, by the time you've dealt with organizations from 30, 40 different countries who have got very different corporate structures, let's just say the national anti-doping organizations, right? Some of them are attached to the government, some of them are independent, some of them have got lots of resources, most of them don't. By the time you've got to and worked out who the right person to speak to is, they've got a zillion other different things to be doing. And so if you're not talking to them in the right way, you may not be able to find a moment for engagement. And this is certainly the case, I would say, on the collaboration point that we've experienced, that we really do want to collaborate. We believe as part of our DNA, that is the right approach. That's the way we solve the problems, particularly with all these environmental factors we described earlier. But trying to resource that properly when you're like us, like most of the organizations, right? When you're small organizations, we've got international reach, that puts a lot of pressure, I think, in terms of just resourcing. So how you prioritize and then execute on that and give things the right attention to have the biggest impact is just, I think, an ongoing challenge that we're all facing, I think, in the sector. But again, it's a privileged challenge to be facing.
Absolutely. And I think another challenge that everyone in the sector is facing is that things are sort of constantly in a state of change. So can you talk about some of the changes, Sean, that you have seen over your career on the legal side, maybe specifically of anti-doping in sport, and the impacts that these changes have had?
Yeah, I think one, athletes having more legal representation is one immediate change, but likewise, the legal representation within sports organisations, whether it's a club, whether it's a team, whether it's a national federation, whether it's a national anti-doping organisation, we've seen the professionalisation, I think, from a legal perspective. I remember we never published it, but we did research with Emma Mason and then later with Tom Cleave on the National Anti-Doping Organisation. We looked at their websites in 2013, 2015, and we researched all of them. I think it was only 20 that actually referenced any link back to WADA or to any athlete-friendly information as an example. And that was just indicative of the time that everyone was so under-resourced. Thankfully, I think the situation has improved greatly. How things have changed is we've just seen a massive professionalisation, more money going into sport, government's more interested in sport. It adds a level of complexity. In response to that complexity, you see more professionalisation. As more professionalisation, again, the scale of everything increases, and there comes a tipping point where you have to say, are we dealing with this in the most effective way? Is it having the impact? And then you introduce regulatory changes to deal with that, basically. And that's what we're seeing in it as a cycle. If you can admit that, whether or not you take a substance of abuse, for example, and you can get a reduced sanction, those type of provisions are coming more in just because of the scale of the issues that are being faced.
That makes sense. And I know we've talked about a lot of challenges, a lot of problems in sport. Perhaps we'll frame it on the positive side here.
Yeah.
What do you see as some of the biggest maybe areas of opportunity in sports law related to anti-doping, Sean?
I think that's trying to take a first principles approach to try and solve the problem. But to be really, really clear in terms of what problem is trying to be solved. Say, for example, issues with lack of athlete awareness, athlete compliance. Just stopping them doing silly things that could be avoided, and working out a better way to do that, whether it's through the numerous educational initiatives that are taking place. But I have a sense that there's just a better way to execute than what we're currently seeing at the moment. I think there's great examples of brilliant work that's taking place and a massive improvement. So I know there's various committees around the world that WADA lead, the initiatives, and the NARDO's lead. But I really think in that space, there's probably some tech now that's going to become very, very useful in that arena that will be very beneficial, whether it's on the delivery of courses, whether it's just informing people of their rights, what can be expected.
Well, I think that's wonderful, Sean. And I think we've talked about how law and sport has grown over the years, but what is your vision for the future of law and sport? And what are maybe your current priorities for the organization going forward?
So for us, really, is maintaining standards at scale. In that people, I like to think, hopefully, when people look at what we do, I know it's high quality. And what I mean by that is, again, we have certain standards in terms of, again, accurate information, informative information, that we're trying to do stuff that's useful to people. So dealing with that at scale is what we're trying to address. What I'd like to see happen is we do a better job of serving people, whether it is the anti-doping community, whether it's the athletes, whether it's the integrity units more broadly, whether it's sports organisation. I think doing a better job of being the independent that we are, to be a positive contributor as much as we do a lot already, I believe, but I would do because I set it up. I always feel like we could do a lot better job in terms of being helpful to people, whether it's for our own independent research, whether it's for flagging other people's research and getting more participation that way. So the future really for us is, how do we do a better job? What I'm focusing my attention on a daily basis is like, how can we do a better job, given all the work that's already taking place, to be a positive contributor to that, rather than, I would say to people joking around, but I mean it, there is no joy in duplicating other people's work. And we don't want to waste our time doing that. If other people have done great work, we'll just tell people that they've done great work and then move on and see how we can build on it. So I like to think we become and continue to be a trusted resource for people, and a place where people know that regardless of, let's say, doping, which side they're on, let's say in terms of like a federation or athlete side or an ARDA athlete side, I don't really like that, thinking in those terms in that way, because I don't think it really articulates the nuances of what goes on. But that's the perception that's always given and felt at times in the sector. But just being useful. So I said, if it is on issues of contamination levels, if it is issues on some of the science, if it is issues on analysing certain regulation, that we can be a place where people can have a trusted forum, have those discussions in a non-partisan way.
Definitely. And I love how this sort of builds on the idea of your organization as a hub that sort of brings everybody who has these interests in sport and law together, whether it's athletes, like you said, sport organizations, or even scientists and others who just want to be part of this community, find information and share information.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's hard in this space because traditionally the problem in sport, as I see it anyway, from a professional services standard perspective or an anti-doping standard, is that people love sport. They want to be involved in it, want to touch it, be part of it. The problem is it can be very hard to earn a living in sport. And because of that, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're an accountant, whether you're a scientist, the frequency of which you may be called upon to give expert advice may be limited in number. And because of that, I think the tendency can be that people withhold information rather than share it, because they naturally think, if I withhold this, another opportunity might come my way. Rather than, I like to think this has been changing over the years, and I think there's still a lot of way to go, rather than actually uplifting the wider market. I have to say there's a lot of great people out there that take this type of approach. If we share more information, if we make the standards higher, that brings the overall average up. So therefore your work will be more impactful. People will be more happy to pay for it, no matter what part of the, let's say, system you're in. And I think that's something that's always a challenge to deal with. Because again, say, for example, you're in a certain part of the world, right, where there's not much of a professional sports industry. When the athletes don't get paid much money, sports administrators don't get paid much money. Are you going to be in a position where you want to help everyone have a better understanding and then help that industry, help the athletes, help everyone else get to the point where it can be more professionalized? Or are you going to be in a position where you think, and I've seen this particularly in the sports law perspective, on both sides of the equation, where people think, actually, I'm going to withhold as much information as possible, which makes sense, again, from a commercial perspective. I'll be the one to get instructed because I know more than everyone else and I'm not going to share anything. There's a commercial model that works, but in terms of if you're trying to grow the industry, and if you care about the sports industry as a whole, we want to be, in my opinion, and again, I'm very biased on this, and I guess unapologetically so, we want to raise their overall standards, right, in my view, because even if you're in a small, let's say, sports country where sport isn't heavily invested, it's going to be much better for you in 5-10 years' time if you've helped really create better infrastructure, right? If you've got a better integrity program, better anti-doping program, that avoids you getting to the scenarios you become a hub. I'm not pointing fingers anywhere, but if you were to become a hub of somewhere known for doping athletes, that's not going to help you in the short term or long term.
That makes sense. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, Sean. I'd love to talk about what you would do if the sky was the limit here. I know there are a lot of resource limitations when it comes to anti-doping. You've mentioned whether it's sort of sport organizations, athletes, et cetera, people who don't have all of the things that they need to be truly successful. But if you had all of the resources you could possibly dream up, what is the one single problem in sports law or anti-doping that you would want to most solve?
The one most consistent problem, simplify the language. That would be the one where you're not having conflicting regulations. And this is difficult just from a linguistic perspective with all the different languages spoken in the world, but really getting to the point where there's consistent language being applied across the regulations, across the contracts, across where everyone's really clear what something means rather than using vagueness or opaqueness to disguise a real intention, or not have someone informed of what the risk profile is and they sign an agreement or they read the regulations, right? Again, I'm a massive advocate of open justice and I believe strongly in rule of law, as you would expect. I'd like to think. You'd hope so, wouldn't you? Yeah, I think if we could get to the point where we have more consistent and clearer language being used across the board, again, we can focus on the more important issues and the people that fall foul of regulations or contracts or governance structures because they don't understand the voting mechanisms, etc. Those type of instances just go down. So everything's a bit more intentional, let's say. That'd be wonderful.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up this issue. I think it's something important for everybody to think about, just the idea that not only is just anti-doping and sports law in general quite complex, but the language differences around the world and how even culturally sort of the meaning of certain words may be different around the world as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And even then when we talked about this, so when we look at anti-doping as an example, we look at how the law applies to the sports sector is why we're called law in sport, not sport in law. And the interesting thing, even if you look at anti-doping, right, so we work with all these professional services firms, we say to them, look, these are organizations that have legal issues, whether it's employment law issues, whether it's governance issues, whether it's risk and compliance, insurance. In anti-doping, whilst we've got the regulatory framework, the governance framework, we've got all the testing, we've got the doping control officers, etc. Can I have two things, by the way, because there is one that I'd love to introduce on anti-doping specifically. But you've still got the law, and this is where we are, that's being helpful. The law still applies to these organizations as it would do any other organization. So having those organizations understand how the law applies to them is just useful. Forget the sport-specific stuff. That data protection being a prime example, that's a hot topic across most organizations in the world. It's pronounced in anti-doping for the reasons for the sensitive data that's there. Understanding that, and that we are an anti-doping organization, but we are just an organization after all, therefore the law still applies to us in all these different areas. Understand that whilst then trying to deal with the sport-specific stuff, I think is the real challenge, I think, for a lot of the organizations, because you end up, what can happen in anti-doping certainly happens in match fixing in other areas. In football, as an example, or other sports, you end up with an echo chamber of people with the same problems, not really finding the solutions. If you see what I mean, but they're all facing the same problems. There are very few that have got a solution. So that's that on that. But then the thing I was going to say, the one thing I would fix, I've talked about this a lot, in anti-doping, if there's one thing I would do is bring safeguarding provisions into anti-doping. I've talked about it a lot. I think it's a massive problem for anti-doping in the future that they haven't thought about this in enough detail. I think it's a really high-risk environment that we don't have global standards for doping control officers in terms of being criminally bureau checked. There's no standard form of identification or way for an athlete to identify who a doping control officer is. And I also think when I speak to teachers or others and you say, can I come in and get a pupil taken to the bathroom?
Right.
Or someone's coming, they get quite alarmed by that for very good reason. And I just think in our pursuit of trying to create a quote unquote clean sport environment, I do wonder sometimes whether we've gone too far. And I don't know is the answer. I leave it to more experienced and more expert people than myself. But I have to say, knowing people in the anti-doping community, this is something that is a concern. And I would like to see a more global solution for that.
Absolutely. I think emphasizing, obviously the clean sport, but the safe sport importance and the impacts that can have.
Yeah, how that applies to anti-doping in particular, because essentially anti-doping's got an exemption at the moment. Often it seems like there's an exemption for anti-doping, but people just assume anti-doping's fine, got it all sorted. And I think that's something, I'm sure it is being looked at, but if you said if there's one thing I could fix, that would be one of the things in anti-doping.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives with us today, Sean. It's been wonderful to learn more about you and your work. But if you've caught the attention of our listeners and they would like to learn even more, what is the best way for them to do so?
That feels like such a sales pitch, doesn't it? Go to lawinsport.com. But that would be the way. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, on Twitter, or X now, Instagram, etc. You can subscribe to our weekly newsletter. We've always dealt with first-party data. We only send it once a week. That's quite useful if you would like to just stay engaged in what we're up to. But yeah, if you want to find out more, go to lawinsport.com.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, definitely check out the website. And Sean, it's been wonderful to chat with you today. We truly appreciate you joining us on the show.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. And the one thing I should have said is I've never known for being concise. I hope for the listeners that it was actually made sense. I said that one of the things I should have said at the beginning was the reason why I do Law in Sport in some ways is kind of like an embodiment of how I see the world, if you see what I mean. And certainly normally being a guest on podcasts is something that I like interviewing people rather than speaking on them.
Hey, well, you did a great job on the other side of the microphone. So
thank you. You're too kind.
It's been wonderful to have you here. And listeners, great to have you here as well. If you haven't already, we would be delighted if you could subscribe and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform to let us know what you think of the show. And listeners, please note that the Anti-Doping Podcast features a wide variety of clean sport experts, and episodes may include statements and/or viewpoints that do not necessarily reflect the views or values of the PCC. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.